So we have an economy that's rebalanced, and it's hard to tell how much of what we've seen recently is the rebalancing and how much of it is us grinding down into a recession. And of course, other events could happen. Right? There's a whole list of potential risk factors out in front of us. It's like a hold your breath moment, right? To see things could go in a good way and they could go in a pretty bad way. And honestly, that should happen in the next 3 months, 6 months. We'll know a lot more.
Claudia Sahm, founder of Sahm Consulting, a former Fed economist, the creator of the Sahm Rule, which is a recession indicator, and the author of the Substack Stay at Home Macro. It is so great to welcome you to the show, Claudia. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you, and I've actually wanted to talk to you for a long time. So it is such a pleasure to have you on the show, Claudia. And I was hoping we could just start with the big picture, your assessment of the macro economy. Take as much time as you would like to set the table, if you will.
Right. So we're at a moment where multiple pieces are coming together, right? And it's really potentially an inflection point. Like, we will know fairly soon, are we getting that soft landing? Is the slowing in the labor market going to level out? Are we going to stay away from a notable increase in the unemployment rate? Or are we in the very slow grind that can lead us over the edge? We have seen a lot of cooling in the labor market. Normally, once things get going, they keep going, and in a bad way in this case. So you can see both stories now. I think, 6 months ago it was a little harder to see the story of inflation's going to come down and we're going to avoid a recession. And yet that looks much more plausible than it did before. So we have an economy that's rebalanced, and it's hard to tell how much of what we've seen recently is the rebalancing and how much of it is us grinding down into a recession. And of course, other events could happen. Right? There's a whole list of potential risk factors out in front of us, as has been the case for the last 4 years. So I think it's like a hold your breath moment, right? To see things could go in a good way and they could go in a pretty bad way. And honestly, that should happen in the next 3 months, 6 months. We'll know a lot more.
So we'll get more clarity in the next 3 to 6 months. A hold your breath moment and an inflection point. That is interesting. Let's kind of explore the scenarios. What are the risk factors that are on your mind?
Well, the two biggest areas that we should be looking to in the economy are the labor market, as I talked about, and then with that is the consumer. Right? In the United States, consumer spending is 70% of the economy. And for most Americans, that spending relies on a paycheck. And they often spend what they earn. So these two move together. And of course, if consumers stop coming to the store, then businesses are going to lay off or not give as many hours to their workers. So these two pieces of the economy fit together. And over in the recovery after COVID, it was really fast. It was really strong, to a point that those kind of job gains, 500,000 a month, rock bottom unemployment rate, and consumer spending that was really moving, those were about getting us out of a hole. Those weren't going to be sustainable. So now it's trying to figure out, are we going back to the sustainable place, or are we going to undershoot that and have workers lose their job, consumers really have to cut back? And to answer those questions, so you think about, well, what is it that's weighing on consumers? And in particular, and these, there's a whole host of things that people have talked about, whether it's, well, actually, I think a big bucket of them fit into the relief programs that have been supporting families and individuals throughout the crisis. They basically all expired. Right. And so we see, and some of the latest ones are, the student loan starting back up, those payments, that's gotten a lot of attention. That's one of the bigger programs. But we've also seen other types of income supports, the extra food stamps, the support in the Medicaid. So there are a lot of there's a lot of income that's getting chipped away at individuals. Well up into the middle class. And it's not clear how much. I mean, people were doing those payments before. People were making do with smaller food stamps before the pandemic. as hard as that is. So now, do we go back to a place where, yeah, we manage it, it's kind of hard, or do we really fall off? And because we've become used to it, or budgets have been shifted around in a way, like if you bought more things on credit, it's very hard to undo some decisions of the last few years. So that's a big question. And the estimates of what this does to consumer spending there's a pretty wide range, but nobody's saying they're positive, right? This is going to have some kind of a negative effect. And the other big one is interest rates have risen a lot in the last year. And up to this point, it appears that families, and to a large extent, businesses have been able to buffer this. They have, for the consumers, both they had some cash on hand, right? They had some, for those who had the extra relief, could pay down debt, could accumulate some savings. And then the labor market has been good. And that's been good for the family. They have the bigger paychecks for the workers. It's also been good for the businesses. They have people coming in the door and buying, and also being able to invest. So that's been happening. I think much to the surprise of many, including at the Fed, given how high and how fast interest rates have gone up. But again, as some of our buffers roll off and the labor market starts to, cool off, those interest rates almost certainly have to have more widespread effects. We can certainly see them in some sectors, but if they spread as they normally would, that adds more pressure on the economy.
Would that be the variable, the long and variable effects that kind of the lags, if you will, that take a while to play out?
Yeah, so this is a very hot and very wonky debate about how long those lags are. Normally, the thinking was with the long and variable lags, it takes time, right? And the main thing is that it has to work through the economy. The Fed makes a decision to raise interest rates, then banks have to increase their borrowing rates for consumers and businesses, and then that starts to trick. Not everybody's out there borrowing, but they are enough that they have to cut back on spending or investment, and it trickles through to the economy. And the more links in the chain, it's pretty reasonable to think it's going to take a while for it to find its way over to the 70% of the economy, a broad-based consumer spending pullback. Okay, so that makes a lot of intuitive sense. There's a lot of empirical evidence over, it's tough to know this, but it did look quite like there were these lags that could be up to 2 years, right? It takes some pretty serious time to get it through. And of course, that's important as the Federal Reserve calibrates, well, how much do we have to do, right? Because they don't have a little dial they turn on the economy, so they have to watch the effects. And it makes a difference as to when you think the effects will show up. Okay, so fast forward to now, and Federal Reserve officials, including Fed Chair Jay Powell, have said, well, it could be different now, right? These lags could be shorter. The argument, and it's intuitively compelling, though contested as to whether this is the case, that as soon as the Fed started to do forward guidance, after they started that right after the Great Recession, that can shorten the lags. And we saw this to some extent with the mortgage rates. When the Federal Reserve got going last year, they were starting to do interest rate increases, but they signaled we're really going to go at this, right? We were behind the curve. So you saw mortgage rates moving up even more than what the Fed had done already, kind of looking ahead. And we saw that at the September FOMC meeting, because their forecasts implied that they were going to do less cuts next year and the year after. And just that telling markets, hey, this is what we think we're going to do in the future, got them to move now. So you can see where that shortens the lag. The Fed doesn't even have to do it before markets react. This is a very tricky tool to use. But so intuitively, then the idea is, then we can actually get ahead and move faster than our rate increases by working through the markets, through forward guidance. There is some research that supports this. But again, if you're estimating something off to 15 years of experience, right? You can't be too certain how much of an effect that is. But yeah, it's a very important question. And I will say just one last thing. The Fed, if they're convinced that the lags are short, under a year, then when they could get in a point where they're like, this is kind of the peak now of the effects and things haven't slowed down as much as they like. So then they could give that as an argument to do more. Whereas if you think they're longer, it's still coming. So yeah, that's why it's gotten to be something of a debate.
There's so many things I want to ask you. And this is why it's so great having you on. And I'm really excited about this. Okay. Do you think, from your viewpoint, do you think the Fed has done too much? Just enough? Like what's kind of your assessment of all of the hikes that we have seen?
So I'm in the camp of it takes quite a while for these interest rates to work through the economy. And I have been concerned for some time that they have been underestimating how much I've been concerned that they're estimating how much the pandemic and the war in Ukraine had disrupted the economy, how much that was behind the high inflation, right? And we've seen the high inflation chip away, in a pretty substantial way over the past, particularly the past 6 months. The unemployment rate has stayed low. That's very consistent with the hypothesis that a lot of the inflation we have is due to the disruptions from COVID in particular, and it takes a long time for them to, unwind. So if that's what's going on with inflation, the Fed, they need to do something. Some of this was demand. We put a lot of stimulus out there. Things move really fast. But if they take the attitude, and I think they have to some extent since last year, that we got this, like this is our job. So that's where you get into a place where the Fed can easily overdo it, right? This isn't all about demand. There's a lot about supply. And if they take too much out on the demand side, like we're just there. So to me, the case for them overdoing it has been there over the last almost 2 years. And yet they did have a role to play. So it's hard to parse out how much we needed the Fed and how much we needed just time to rebalance. But I think when I will say at this point, the risk of doing too much is very much aligned with the risk of doing too little. And you even have Fed officials like the New York Fed president, John Williams, last week.
Yeah, wait, I want to hear a bit more. I want to hear a bit more on that part, the risk being aligned with doing too much and doing too little. Can you just flesh that out a bit?
Right. So the argument in the Federal Reserve, we have interest rates that went up a little over 5% just points within basically a year. Right. And I think there was a justification last year. Inflation, COVID kept coming back. The supply chains didn't heal. We had high inflation. Like there were a lot of reasons why it was time for the Fed to go and to make some pretty serious increases in the rates. And I disagreed with the big rate increases in the fall. I thought they had done a sufficient amount, but there was a consistent, particularly from the Fed up through just recently, and you can see these in their projections, like they have kind of a risk summary at the end of the summary of economic projections. If you ask them, like you have an inflation forecast, if you ask them what's more likely, inflation to come up higher or lower, higher had been the dominant feature. And honestly, when a Fed policymaker would like to be in a place where they're balanced, like we're doing the thing that we think, good things happen, bad things happen, but we're kind of running down the middle. And for, quite some time now, policymakers, and I think a lot of the economists in the space, the pundit, this was, inflation there was a lot of concern about it getting out of control. What has given the Fed more space, not surprisingly, is inflation coming down. Like they're not doing a victory lap. I think that's appropriate. I think they may end up overdoing it by not. There's a lot of discounting of good news in the world, and I understand that, but that shouldn't be happening with policymakers. Like they ought to be just looking with a clear head at the data. So it really is about what's happening with inflation, and if inflation is coming down on its own, and the Fed keeps piling on, that's where they're going to do too much in terms of taking too much demand out of the economy. And the risk of doing too little, which again, that they'd had for some time, is if they don't raise interest rates enough, inflation stays high. There were fears last year, I think less now, that it could even pick up. And from the historical experiences in the 1970s, if you kind of are soft on inflation, then it can actually get even more embedded, and you have to do more. This is the narrative. This is the big fear at the Fed. I don't think it's appropriate right now, but again, there's some logic to it.
Yeah, this is so fascinating. Okay, so on the inflation part, do you think that, I guess what I'm kind of trying to ask is, the inflation, perhaps it would have come down naturally as like supply chains and whatnot worked themselves out. How much do you think is fair to attribute to the Fed's rate hikes in the inflation fight? Or do you think maybe it wasn't the rate hikes that helped bring inflation down?
Right. Well, first of all, economists will argue about this forever, right? This is a very open question. I think one thing that's important to think about is that this has been a very fluid situation, right? As the supply chains have started to ease, as people have started to go back to work, some of these supply factors that had been causing a lot of disruption in the economy, pushing up prices. I mean, if we don't have as much stuff and the demand is there, prices will go up. Autos were an excellent example of this. As those start to ease, well, that piece of inflation starts to ebb. I think probably last year, a little bit earlier than that, there's an economist at the San Francisco Fed, Adam Shapiro, and there are a lot of estimates like this out there, so I don't want to say we know anything definitively. His estimates of inflation were roughly about 50-50 of the supply disruptions and extra demand. And that would shift around over time, because when the supply chains were still a real issue, that would be, he was estimating that was more than the demand side. And yet we're to a place now where a lot of these, I think there's still more out there, but we've seen a lot of the disruptions in supply. I mean, that's been a lot of the easing over the last year, right? That's been an important part, because we've seen the especially durable goods prices really move down. And then we are still in a place where inflation is not nearly as elevated as it was, but it's still not where the Fed wants it. It's still not where people want it, right? I mean, everyone wants inflation that's lower. And so then we're into this piece. And I think, we have had a strong labor market. There is demand out there. So I think is this combination of the rate increases have taken some of the demand out of the economy. We've seen it most in the investment sector. The spread into larger sectors like the consumers has been less apparent, but I mean, it's always moved there, right? So, but I think, so to some extent, the inflation that's come down is from the Fed. I think the larger piece of the last 6 months is the supply chain disruptions. And I should underscore, it's not just the Fed that's taking demand out. Right? Earlier, we talked about all of these pandemic relief programs that have been expiring. And that's a piece, I mean, those are like income goes directly to families to spend. The interest rates are they work with the borrowers. It's like a little bit around the edges. So there's definitely been some economic policy, both the Fed and fiscal, that has helped to slow down demand. And, and it takes a while for this to all show up in consumer prices. Like there's a lot of dynamics. There's a lot of decisions that corporations, businesses make about their pricing. So it's a really complicated mix. I think it's been appropriate for the Federal Reserve to be in the mix. And yet, again, I think they need to hold off at this point. And the consensus appears to be at the Fed, especially as the data come in a favorable way, that's where they're headed.
Yeah. Claudia, I know you've done a lot of work on the consumer, including when you were at the Fed. What is, and I know you kind of touched on it earlier, but what is your assessment of the consumer today?
So, like I said before, it's so tied up with where the jobs go, right? And what we've seen through almost all of this recovery is a consumer that's in a, I wouldn't say a good, and you can't say one thing, and the consumers are not a lump of consumers, right? You have a whole range of experiences. The support, from the federal government in particular during the pandemic, and particularly as we got started into the recovery, so with like the rescue plan, these were unprecedented amounts of money and the various kinds of programs going out to help families, and that's in individuals, and that we hadn't done that before. And there's a lot of arguments about whether we did too much, or I don't think there's a lot we did too little, but there was definitely a substantial amount of money that went out to help people. The idea of it this time was as much relief, get you to the other side of this crisis, as it was stimulus. Of course, it did stimulate the economy as well. So we saw household balance sheets in an incredibly good place. And frankly, for the bottom 50% of households by wealth, you saw increases in the wealth they were holding relative to before the pandemic. So that, if you have a financial cushion, if you've been able to pay down debt, if you have some extra income, if you start getting either a raise or more, being able to move to a better job, these put the consumer, individuals, in a better place. And their spending needs, both, catching up with, if you'd lost any footing in the pandemic, in the recession, kind of getting back on track. And frankly, we gave people an ability, many people, to get into a better place. Right. And we've seen that, at least, the aggregate spending data give us a read on this, that consumers have been, what we call resilient, and we've seen, there's always a debate. 1 month the data will come in a little weaker than another. But if you look kind of broad brush over, periods of 3 months, 6 months, the consumer is still doing well. And this has been to some puzzling, given the higher interest rates, expiration of the stimulus. Yeah, but yeah. Oh, and I will say the other thing, we've had the high inflation, and that obviously has been it's been a true hardship on some people. It's been an annoyance on everyone. Like, no one likes to go into the store and see that what they always buy has now like 30%, 20% higher in price than before the pandemic. So it totally makes sense that this is a problem. Like, it is legitimately a problem. It's also weighing on consumers. Like, if you ask them how they're doing, like, this is a big, really weighs on them. And yet, when the aggregate the consumption data is adjusted for inflation, right? So we're seeing people, at least on aggregate, walking out of the store with not just as much as before the pandemic, but actually more, right? And while that doesn't necessarily translate into I'm going to be happy about the economy, because there are lots of problems, it's really important, and that people have what they need. Many people, not all. And this was absolutely not the experience after the Great Recession, right? So there are some real wins here. It's just unfortunate, there are a lot of wins and losses over the last 4 years.
Yeah. Well, you point out it wasn't the same experiences after the Great Recession. What do you think changed?
They were fundamentally different recessions, right? So, both were very severe in the sense that the unemployment rate moved up. We went into the Great Recession. That was a blow up in the financial sector, and particularly the mortgage market. And of course, that, there were households who were buying homes that were now underwater, and unlike now, where household balance sheets got better after the recession, household balance sheets got worse after the recession. So that obviously that caused a lot of pain and dislocation. But the other piece of it, but the pandemic caused a lot of pain and dislocation too, right? It was a very different form, and so they were both very severe events, very severe recessions. There are a number of reasons that one can point to. Again, a key one could just be this was a very different kind of recession. There also was a very different response on getting relief to people and businesses, right, to get them out of the recession. rescue plan, what Obama put in place right after he came into office was about $1 trillion. And that was largely that was the big push of stimulus. We spent about $5 trillion to fight this recession and get the recovery going. Again, this could end up being kind of a Goldilocks thing, that like $5 trillion may have been more than we needed to do. Like we kind of were shooting on the upside, and the $1 trillion was clearly too little. And then other programs that were set up to address the mortgage, the households underwater, these just didn't, they were there, but they didn't work. Right. So I think I think the fiscal relief was important. I think the type of recession was important. The big lesson, and regardless of how we get it, is that a rapid recovery in the labor market does an amazing amount of good. Like it took us, it really wasn't until the couple years before the pandemic that we had really hit a spot in the expansion of the labor market that was good. We're like bringing lots of people back in. We were doing that within 2 years of the pandemic hitting. And so that on its own, it gets a dynamic going that you don't need to send out more checks, stimulus checks. If you got the labor market going, they're getting paychecks.
Yeah. Yeah. So I also want to bring up, the Sahm Rule for folks. And I find this so fascinating too, and you have your own rule named after you. Could you explain what it is? And then I'll have some follow-on questions, but just to kind of set the table, what is the Sahm Rule? How did you come up with it? And what does it mean?
So first, I'll give the origin story of the Sahm Rule. It really was a sidebar to what I was trying to do. In 2019, I had a proposal to put stimulus checks on autopilot. So it was part of a volume out of Brookings. It was about what we call automatic stabilizers. So like take the politics out of it, tie the relief that we always do in recessions, tie it to the economy, to the economic data, and let it go. I'd done a lot of research on the stimulus checks, after the Great Recession and other kinds of relief. And so that was my proposal. And I had all this research about why we should do stimulus checks. That was really the focus of it. And then it's like, okay, well, if you want to have an automatic sending out the stimulus checks, you have to have something that says hit go. So that's what the Sahm Rule is, which I did not name after myself. That came from others. And it was a principle that, I put it into place and really did the crunching of the numbers to make sure it was very accurate. Right? Because again, the government doesn't want to send out hundreds of billions of dollars and then be like, oh, wasn't a recession. People will be fine with this, but the deficit would have some issues. And so there's this principle, and I think I alluded to this in the beginning, why I get worried about what's happening in the labor market, is that once things get going in a bad direction, they keep going. And this is absolutely true with the unemployment rate. Normally, in recessions, the pandemic was a different case. The unemployment rate actually peaks after the recession is over, right? Because it takes time, and it's this sign of the feedback effects, like I talked about with the interest rate. We have a $24 trillion economy. Normally, it does not turn on a dime unless you shut it down, like we did to keep us safe from the pandemic. So what the Sahm Rule, the definition of it is you take the national unemployment rate, do the 3-month moving average, never want to overreact to 1 month of data. So you take the average and then you compare the most recent value to the low over the prior 12 months. And if that unemployment rate has increased a 0.5 percentage point or more, 0.5 percentage point, like this is a small increase, right? 0.5 percentage point or more, we are in a recession. And, we are within 2 to 3 months of a recession inside of it. So the Sahm Rule doesn't predict recessions, but it's a very accurate indicator, at least in the past, of we're in a recession. And that's important because it takes time. Like the National Bureau of Economic Research is kind of our recession arbiter. They often don't call a recession until a year later. So waiting an extra year to send out the fiscal relief, that's too long. Like you can do a lot more good in the early months of a recession than towards the end. Again, I thought of it, I developed it in terms of thinking about fiscal relief, and that's not the most common use of it now. I mean, I'm more than happy that I have been able to help in this debate about, are we in a recession? Are we going into a recession? But that's not why it exists. The other thing I say about it to people is it's not a law of nature, right? It's an empirical regularity that we've seen. I mean, it's completely accurate back to the 1970s, and it's nearly perfect back to World War II. So it's a very accurate, because again, it has this logic of how the economy works. So it is very accurate, and yet we know in this particular, everything since the pandemic, we have seen economic regularities, empirical, just break left and right. And maybe not so sad to see the Phillips curve, the inflation unemployment one going down. But we had something last year that happened. We had 2 quarters of a decline in GDP, and we weren't in a recession. And the labor market was going great. I had a lot of discussions about the labor market and the Sahm Rule. Then that's never happened in the United States outside of a recession, the 2 quarters. So the Sahm Rule, we might go up to 4% unemployment. But the Fed and this would be a Sahm Rule breaking if it just levels out there. It doesn't keep going. Like, that's never happened before. But there's so many things that have never happened before in this cycle. But I don't, it's an empirical regulator that's held up over a lot of time. So I also don't want to march out and do this time is different. I think I have to take it seriously.
Yeah. Real quick, what is the Sahm Rule signaling right now? Like, what's the latest?
We're not in a recession.
Not in a recession.
Yeah. Okay. Even with, the unemployment rate moved up to 3.8%. This is now 2 months ago. And, but this again, and a lot of it was like people came into the labor force. It was like a good increase in the unemployment rate. And we'll see soon whether it came back down, which is expected. But again, this is where taking the 3-month average, right? We don't want to, it could be that that's really telling us something, and we kind of move into this danger zone in the coming months. But the Sahm Rule was a 1/10. And again, the trigger is 5/10. So, but it's not being in a recession now is absolutely no guarantee of not being in one 6 months from now, right? It's really not a forecast tool, but in general, a rising unemployment rate, even less than 5, like, it's not a good sign.
Yeah. And I keep hearing like that is a real concern and worry for you. And I know we've brought it up, but just exploring that further, because I was writing some notes down that it might go up to 4%. And the Sahm Rule would be breaking if it just levels out there. Can we just kind of hear more from you on the labor side of things and the concerns there?
Yeah, well, I think the Fed actually sees that scenario as like the good one, right? They think the unemployment rate is too high to be sustainable, or too low. I'm sorry, it's too low right now to be sustainable, especially when we're in the 3.4%, 3.5%. I mean, and they're where they think is a sustainable, we could keep at it for years and years, is much more like 4% and a little bit higher, right? So they, and I like the logic that they use to do all this stuff, I'm very skeptical of, right? It's all very model based and very serious, but I don't totally buy it. But I think a 3.4% unemployment rate that's really low. So and that's part of the if we've been kind of averaging around 3.5%, going up to 4%, that triggers the Sahm Rule. Now, normally, once you've started to see that kind of increase in the unemployment rate, it keeps going, and we're talking 2 percentage points, 5%. I mean, like, these are big increase. It depends on the severity of the recession, but these are not, you've gone up 0.5 and then you just hang out at that level, right? And so what that, the explanation of that, and the Fed doesn't do a lot to explain that. I mean, like, it's a really unusual forecast, but if you thought that, there were disruptions from the pandemic that had really pushed pushed the labor market into kind of a haywire place. Like there was all this demand and they had all these people coming back and we were missing people out of the labor force. So if you got to a more normal place, then you could imagine, well, we just settle in to normal. And that's, I looked at it more on the job creation side, which the Fed doesn't forecast. We've seen, every month we look at how many on net jobs are created in the economy. So the payroll employment. And what we've seen is the rate at which we are creating jobs every month has been cut in half over the course of this past year. Now we were coming into it at a really high rate. So it's not saying anyone should have thought the pace in January, pace in early the year was sustainable, but that's a pretty rapid decline, like slowing down. So then the question is, and now we're to a place where we're kind of running at numbers that are about, maybe a little bit less than before the recession, but, kind of in that space. So it's like, well, what stops that? Like we've had these big declines in how fast we're adding jobs to the economy. What levels that out, right? How do we tell the economy, oh, you're back to normal, and you just kind of keep at this pace? Because normally you get a dynamic like that going and it keeps going, right? So that's the piece where I'm very interested, and others are too, to just see that rapid cooling that we've had. Does it just, do we just kind of hang out here and we've gotten back to some sense of balance? But all of that relies on that we had these disruptions and they have worked themselves out, and that's what's been causing, and then we're good. And that's very equivalent to the Sahm Rule. Maybe unemployment rate goes up some, and then it just kind of hangs out because that's what we say is normal. But I'm not sure a $24 trillion economy just kind of hangs out, right? Like it has a dynamic.
Yeah. So I'm trying to put this together too. Mm-hmm. There's still a risk of a recession out there. Do you have, and I don't want to like penny down on this or anything, but I take it that's still very much a concern looking out. And how do you contextualize that? Has it come down for you? It's not as big of a risk, or I don't know if that's a good question, but I'm just trying to contextualize maybe where you are now today versus, call it beginning of the year maybe, or even last year.
Right. So throughout this cycle, the recovery, I have and still am firmly in the camp of we do not need a recession to get inflation down. We may get a recession, but it's not, these two are not connected. And the last 6 months have been extremely heartening to see inflation come down without, and core inflation even started to slow without the unemployment rate moving up. So that's the first thing. I mean, regardless, there's this question of like, what do we need? What do we need the policymakers to do? And that very bad approach is, I think that's really been put to rest. Like we don't need that. The reason that I have been in the soft landing camp is I did think that there was a lot of on the supply side rebalancing that would get inflation down. And I guess to understand why is inflation so connected to the recession, with the Federal Reserve, they will keep pushing up interest rates or keeping interest rates high until they see inflation coming down. And the more and more that the Fed pushes into the economy, then interest rates are a price. They're a very different one than the price at the grocery store, but they're, the price of borrowing, and that means people hire less, they make less investments. And so the higher inflation stays, the more aggressive the Fed is. And we have certainly had recessions in the past, but it's been a while where the Fed caused them, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So that's where the recession, while high inflation is not necessarily a feature of a recession, right? Like inflation can be high, we are not in a recession. And yet high inflation can be something that gets us into a recession because how the Federal Reserve acts. So for a lot of my being convinced that we could get inflation down without having a market increase in the unemployment rate came from the fact that the Fed, my belief that the Fed didn't need to, they weren't going to have to do all of it to get inflation down. And that would happen fast enough that they would start to back off. And I mean, I'd said for some time that we all better hope that the labor market is as strong as the Fed keeps complaining it is, right? Because they've had to buffer. And I think we've largely seen that for the last year or so. But these things, so I've been optimistic that the pieces were in place, like that we could have this happen. But a lot of those arguments were last year, into this year, where it's more abstract, right? Like we haven't seen all the pieces come together. There's hints of it, but and so now it's they're there. I think I'm probably more in the baseline, more in the 50-50 case. I am again, I'm really concerned about what we're seeing in the labor market. I mean, that's my big focus, and we are. And then off the baseline, but kind of in the risks that are ahead of us, the consumer is not, and the business owner is not in as resilient a place as they were, say, a year ago. And the more risks that come at people, like eventually you do have a breaking point. And I worry that, and we've seen some risks materialize that one hadn't necessarily expected a year ago. I mean, the student loans were going to run off, although there was a chance there was going to be some forgiven, right? And then that didn't turn out. I think what's happening with the oil prices and potentially down the road, the gas prices, it's not surprising, but it wasn't on people's radar. And I still think that there are pressure points in the financial system, particularly in the banking sector, that could rear their ugly head again. And we're just at a point where every time something blows up, it just ups the odds that we go over the cliff. And honestly, most recessions are something happens, right? Like it's not, the Fed right now is not trying to cause a recession. So they're not just like cranking all at one meeting like Volcker did in the 1980s. Usually it's just something that blows up. And frankly, there are enough, even of the things we know that are out there that could blow up, there's enough of them. And then honestly, it's usually something we didn't expect. So, and I don't see where the economy is in the same place as to buffer. So frankly, I've probably gotten more pessimistic, but I still, the pieces are there. And I do think that we've done a lot of rebalancing in the economy. So there is the argument that we're going to rebalance and then take a deep breath, right? Like we're in a place we can move along.
Yeah, it sounds very much like 50-50. You mentioned somewhere in here, I know in this conversation, we did mention housing, like mortgage rates are up in a major way. Do you have a perspective on housing? I'm asking as a millennial who would like to buy a house, but kind of feel like, it's a little difficult right now.
Yeah, so housing is an extremely complicated sector right now. I mean, you talk about something that's not acting like it would normally do in a Fed interest rate cycle. The one thing that the past 4 years, the pandemic, the time after that, has done is it took pre-existing problems, like things that we came into the pandemic with in the economy, and it amplified them. Right. So a big problem right now in the housing market is the lack of supply of homes. So it's and there's a lot of you can point to, well, interest rates were so low before the Fed started their interest rate hikes. People had bought really low interest rates. They refi, like they don't want to get out in the housing market. And so that was constraining supply. So there are some special features. And then even though interest rates are high, because you have so little inventory on the market, there's enough demand to go after that and keep house prices high, right? Like, which normally you ought to like really slow down demand with these kind of mortgage rates. Okay, so, and you can tell a story, and you need to tell a story to some extent with pandemic features and policy responses to explain where we got. Okay, so But unless when we're living under a rock before the pandemic, we all know that the United States has had a long-standing, decades-long shortage of housing, right? And often it's what's missing are the kind of starter homes, the more, less expensive. I mean, they're all expensive now, but ones that are more moderately priced. And that's something, and that was true both in the housing, also in the rental, right? Like we didn't have enough supply. So then we got in this position, well, if you have some special factor that kind of pulls in supply, well, then it's even worse than before. And then we had, so I think that's one where the lesson, we have an opportunity from this crisis to look and be like, we weren't prepared for something like this to happen. Right. In addition to the Federal Reserve's response, you also had, because of work from home, people moving all over the country. Like there was a lot of moving pieces in the housing market. You couldn't bring in, you couldn't sell the home in the end because it didn't have a garage door yet, because it hadn't got off the boat. I mean, like there were just a lot of things that happened in terms of producing housing. And a lesson from that is that we don't have, and housing is not the only one. There are lots of pieces of our production supply chains that are fragile. Right. And to some extent, where we came into this was all very, not necessarily efficient. Like there were reasons there wasn't enough supply. I mean, a lot of that was regulatory and other pieces like that. But we really learned in the pandemic how vulnerable, or we should have learned, how vulnerable that we were to big disruptions happening. And part of the vulnerability is that we already didn't have what we needed, right, in terms of the housing supply. So I will say, we'll get to the other side of this very disrupted, unusual housing market. The mortgage rates will come down, not right away, and maybe not even next year entirely. But that doesn't mean that we've solved the housing supply. And frankly, we could have made it worse. High interest rates are not normally would not be a big incentive to go and buy. To go and build. Now, higher demand helps with that some, but yeah, it's not that COVID's going to fix our longstanding problems, but the best we can hope for is that it calls attention to them and like the added urgency of fixing the problem.
Yeah. Another thing I want to bring up with you is, Claudia, you spent over a decade at the Federal Reserve as a Fed economist. I'm a complete and total outsider, and sometimes the Fed doesn't always feel like super approachable. That's just me, like with my outside opinion. But could you take us inside? Well, talk to us about how you got to the Fed and the work you did there. But could you also just kind of take us inside maybe a bit of the inner workings, and what are some of the things that folks should understand or know about the Federal Reserve?
Yeah. So after I finished my PhD at the University of Michigan, I went straight to the Fed. So my professional career as an economist, that's where it started, and that's the big piece of it. I joined the staff's macroeconomic forecast, and my specialty was consumer spending. So it's a lot about consumers, and that process, to me, it underscores something that you'll hear the Fed say a lot in public, right? They're data driven, right? Like that this is a big principle of the Fed and how it does its policymaking. It's also a big principle of how the staff does its work, right? It's a very let's go look at the data. Let's look at patterns historically. I mean, obviously a forecast is playing those out into the future, though we and the Fed officials reflect this as well. You do this with a lot of humility, right? You get out more than a year. A monkey can forecast as well as any top forecaster. I mean, there's so much that happens, throwing darts, we might as well, but we don't. We do careful modeling. So there's a big piece of data, understanding the data. What might not, if you hear someone's a forecaster, what might not be obvious is the amount of time you spend figuring out what's going on right now. And I think some of the discussion that I had underscored, kind of talking about, I see this in the data, I see this in the labor market, and then trying to play out, well, how would that normally go? Like, where does that go in the future? So you have to have a good sense of where you are to do the forecasting. Unfortunately, right now, with so many things happening, like the housing market being very complicated, the models that you would use in the past or the thinking, one should be very skeptical of them. And so I think the Fed, even more than usual, is focused on the data that we get. There are some real downsides to that. Like the people at the Fed, at the board, the staff, know these data better than anyone. Like they're pretty complicated how they get put together. And yet it's, if you have a hyper focus on the next month of CPI inflation data, you can really get head faked because there's a lot of things that happen. So that was a big piece, from working at the Fed, particularly on the forecast, being very data driven, lots of different kinds of data. I often referred to the Fed as the Hoover vacuum of data. Like we pull it all in. Now there's a piece of that analogy that is less positive in that we pull it in, we don't push it back out, right? And I think that's improved some over time. So that's where the transparency piece, the Fed isn't talking to me like they're, there's a lot of truth to that. And the Fed is aware of that and tries. Not always, the Fed officials have gotten much more into the communication policy. You can find them every day giving speeches or on the news. And that's a very powerful tool from the Fed. It's not always a well-executed tool, because they'll be like, why did people think that's what I was saying? And I'm like, because that's what you said, so talking is hard, especially for economists. So that's a piece of it. And then the other thing about the forecast, and this is really important, and this wasn't intuitive to me when I started, is getting the numbers right is not enough, right? You need to get a forecast right for the right reason. And if you get something right for the wrong reason, then that's not helpful. So, individuals who had forecasted, inflation is going to go so high in the United States and, the rescue plan is awful, like the fiscal package in 2021. Well, the inflation did go really high. It went higher than, frankly, any of us thought. But we also didn't know about Delta and Omicron and Ukraine. Like there were other factors that came into play that had nothing to do with the fiscal policy. So you have to tell the right story, because then this is where if you told the story of it's the demand, it's the rescue plan, then that's how you come to the conclusion we need a recession. The storytelling is frankly the most important part of the forecasting. It's getting a number right is frankly not that helpful. It feels good, right? Like you want to get your forecast and your numbers right. It's about, do you have the trajectory? So like in the discussions of, are we going to have a soft landing or a hard landing? People aren't fighting necessarily about, will the unemployment rate be, 4.3 or 6%? Well, actually that one's a big, but you don't argue about 4.3 versus 4.4. These fine distinctions they're not what's important. And frankly, the data could revise and the data could jump around from month to month. But it is extremely important when you say, this is my base case. And then you can argue with the base case. So that was something, again, when I was like, I'm going to be a forecaster at the Fed, I was thinking about turning the cranks on some big forecast model. And in fact, the group I was in, that's the staff's forecast, where we do analysis of the data, we do forecasting models, and then we apply judgment. And learning how to do all of those things in a sensible way, that's the core of the training of a macroeconomist at the Fed. So I feel very blessed that I had that. And then you're doing all this in the application of policy, which there are plenty of really good forecasters on Wall Street, but they're not advising the Federal Reserve on how to think about interest rates. And I'd also say I spent a year at the White House in the Council of Economic Advisors, and that's a very similar principle. that you want to bring data and judgment, and you're obviously advising a different set of policymakers. So that I'm very thankful for that training at the Fed, and it gives me. I don't always agree with the Fed officials and the decisions they make, and yet I know I have a lot of confidence in the information analysis that they have, their staff, and frankly, some of them are former Fed economists, so they come into it in a very thoughtful way. The last thing I'll say about being at the Fed, and this is where sometimes I'm less confident of their policymaking, is it tends to be a closed system. In particular at the board, this is less true maybe at the reserve banks, but at the board, I'd like to say you're born a Fed economist and you die a Fed economist. And some people escape. I mean, I'm one of the escapees, but in general, our senior staff started at the board as junior staff. That allows us to have a very cohesive training, a very cohesive way of thinking about the forecast, thinking about what Fed officials need to do monetary policy. And yet it doesn't take too much to think about, well, that can be a real drawback too, that you're not bringing in outside voices in a way that can challenge the thinking. And that can lead you pretty far astray. And frankly, macroeconomics, this is not just the Fed. You can get these closed silos of this is the way we think about things. And if you don't think like us, you can go away. And if you're training people young, like they kind of develop into it. So the Federal Reserve there are real dangers. And I think, frankly, examples of groupthink taking hold and little c conservative, don't want to rock the boat, don't want to get out too ahead. You can see it in some of the biases that I at least see in the policy making recently. The Fed wants to very much avoid being the art, but being the Fed of the 1970s that pulled away too soon and didn't get inflation down. And it's just like, so it's like Volckers floating over the boardroom table. And it's like, this is not the 1970s. The economy, like the inflation threat that the Fed is facing, looks nothing like what Paul Volcker had when he came in as Fed chair. So there is this little, like, looking back at precedent and not wanting to make a mistake and having these old models of thinking. So as with any organization, it has its strengths and it has its weaknesses. Another weakness that you referred to is their ability to communicate and have people understand. This is a real passion of mine in terms of trying to communicate to people, not just to markets, but to people, what the Federal Reserve is and what they're doing. I think it's a real disservice to, at the end of the day, the Federal Reserve serves the American people. Their policies work through Wall Street. They need Wall Street to understand what they're doing, but they're not serving Wall Street. Sometimes it might appear that way. They're serving the American people, and frankly, the decisions they make have a big effect on regular people, and most don't understand what the Fed does, and that is not at the fault of people. The Fed is very opaque. So I try my best to open up that conversation. It's hard because I even struggle at times to figure out what they're trying to say and do.
Yeah. And if you struggle with it, imagine the rest of us. I have to say, Claudia, I've really enjoyed having you on and just listening to you and learning from you. And I want to give you the next few minutes. Share with folks where they could follow you on social media, read some of your work, subscribe to your Substack, and any parting thoughts, anything that we didn't bring up in the course of this discussion that you'd like to share, like anything that's on your mind. Please take the next few moments to do so.
So in terms of where to find me, I think the best place this kind of conversation is carried on would be on my Substack. So the Stay-at-Home Macro, Sahm, so it's a play on my name.
Love it.
That's a place where at least weekly I write on these issues, bringing monetary policy, also fiscal policy, those kind of conversations, and I try hard to make it accessible. So that's a great place to start. I am a regular contributor at Bloomberg Opinion. So if that's someplace you go to read, and there I write on inequality or issues affecting different groups in the population. I've written on workers with disabilities. My last one was on food prices and the supply of food. And so it's not always but I take a pretty broad brush. But there I tend not to write about the Federal Reserve. So that's a lot of my Substack. But it's been, I'm really blessed to have different platforms and different kinds of messages to give. But the Bloomberg Opinion is very worker heavy, and because I think that's important. I am now to a limited extent on social media. So my handle on Twitter is at Claudia_Sahm. Often that at this point, that's for sharing my writing and my press sometimes, but that can be a nice quick summary of the pieces that I write. And I also do, in addition to all of this writing and having opportunities like this to talk with people, I mean, Sahm Consulting, I do work with, more specialist kind of on-demand consumer research, macroeconomic research, policy research. So I'm there to tailor. I mean, I'm here to help people understand the economy and make good decisions regardless of who they are. So those are the main, and I also am on LinkedIn. So, but again, so you can find me various places. So that's me. And I very much welcome in any of these formats feedback on the work that I'm doing or other ideas. One of the things that I benefited most from in the pandemic was the opportunity to talk with people who were living experiences that I was not living. Right? I'm maybe unlike some of my macroeconomist peers. I take a lot of stock in learning from people. You never want to go and do policy on one anecdote, but a lot of times it inspires me to go look in the data, look and see if there are others and what are the policy responses. So I like people. So let me know your thoughts. In terms of closing thoughts on the economy, right now it's easy to go out into the news, and I think in our own lives too. Like, it's always easy to find something that's really tough. And there are people that are legitimately suffering right now in the recovery. There were people that were legitimately suffering before the pandemic, right? We have some serious safety net issues in the United States, and yet they're like, the recovery that we have seen in the labor market, the opportunities that have been extended to people that haven't had them, the job opportunities that most people have benefited from, this is really good and should not be taken for granted. So there are good things out in the economy. All is not lost, right? We don't have to go over the cliff. So I know this has been a 4 years that have been extremely tough on people, and yet we have made a lot of progress. And there is an other side to this, and I think frankly we're in that place. So I think that's, I want to end on a positive note too, because I don't think we get enough of that.
Yeah, very true. Well, Claudia Sahm, thank you so much for being so generous with your time, your ideas, and your wealth of knowledge. I really appreciate you coming on, and I hope to have you back on again. Thanks again, Claudia.
That'd be great. Thank you.